Margaret Chen adjusted her old brown cardigan as she walked through the glass doors of First National Bank. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor, and the familiar smell of coffee from the break room, mixed with the scent of fresh flowers someone had placed near the entrance. She clutched her grandmother's leather purse a little tighter. The purse had seen better days, with worn corners and a small tear near the handle that she had mended with careful stitches years ago. At 67, Margaret moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades teaching high school mathematics. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her comfortable walking shoes made soft sounds against the polished floor. She wore no jewelry except for a small gold cross necklace that had belonged to her mother. The bank buzzed with typical Tuesday morning activity. Young professionals in sharp suits hurried past, checking their phones while waiting in line. A mother bounced her baby while trying to balance her checkbook. An elderly man in overalls studied a loan application with intense concentration. Margaret took her place in line, watching the scene with the observant eyes of someone who had spent years managing teenage students. Behind the counter, 3 tellers worked steadily through the morning rush. The youngest one, a girl who looked barely out of college, had bright pink nail polish and spoke in animated whispers to her coworker between customers. The middle teller, a man in his 30s with carefully styled hair, moved with mechanical efficiency, barely making eye contact with the people he served. The third teller, an older woman with kind eyes, took extra time with each customer, especially the elderly ones who needed help with their paperwork. Margaret watched these interactions with interest. She had always believed you could learn everything about a person's character by watching how they treated others when they thought no one important was looking. It was a lesson her parents had taught her long ago, back when they first arrived in America, with nothing but hope and determination. When her turn came, Margaret approached the counter where the young teller with pink nails waited. The girl looked up briefly, her eyes scanning Margaret's modest appearance before returning to her computer screen with barely concealed disinterest. "How can I help you today?" the teller asked in a tone that suggested she was already thinking about her lunch break. "I'd like to make a withdrawal from my savings account." "Please," Margaret said politely, placing her worn leather purse on the counter. "How much are we talking about?" the teller asked, her fingers already hovering over the keyboard. $25,000. The typing stopped. The young teller's eyes snapped up to study Margaret more carefully, taking in the faded cardigan, the practical shoes, and the old purse. A small frown creased her forehead as she processed this information. "Could you repeat that amount, please?" $25,000, Margaret said again, her voice calm and patient. The teller's frown deepened. She glanced toward her supervisor, who was helping another customer, then back at Margaret. "Okay, I'll need to see some identification and your account information." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license and a small booklet where she kept her account numbers, written in her careful handwriting. She had never trusted keeping everything on her phone like younger people did, old habits from her teaching days when she insisted her students write everything down to remember it better. The teller took the documents and began typing, her pink nails clicking against the keys. Margaret noticed the girl's expression change as information appeared on her screen. The frown turned into something closer to suspicion. "Ma'am, this is quite a large amount," the teller said, her voice now carrying a different tone. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes, I'm quite sure," Margaret replied. "It's for my nephew's college tuition. He's starting his 2nd year at the state university, and his scholarship didn't cover everything." The explanation seemed to make the teller even more suspicious. She looked at Margaret again, clearly struggling to reconcile the modest appearance with the substantial bank balance showing on her screen. Margaret had seen this look before throughout her life. The look that said, "You don't belong here. This can't be right. I'm going to need to get my supervisor," the teller announced, stepping away from the counter without waiting for Margaret's response. Margaret watched as the young woman hurried over to the man with styled hair, whispering urgently in his ear while gesturing back toward the counter. The supervisor looked up, his eyes immediately finding Margaret and studying her with the same suspicious expression his employee had worn. Other customers in line began to notice the delay. A businessman behind Margaret checked his watch impatiently and muttered something under his breath about efficiency. The mother with the baby shifted the child to her other hip and craned her neck to see what was causing the holdup. Margaret remained calm, drawing on decades of experience dealing with difficult situations. She had faced suspicious looks before, from parents who questioned whether the quiet Asian woman could really teach their children advanced mathematics, from store clerks who followed her around as if she might steal something, from neighbors who seemed surprised when they learned she owned her modest house outright. The supervisor approached the counter with measured steps, his expression serious and professional in a way that immediately put Margaret on alert. She recognized the look of someone who had already made up their mind about a situation before hearing all the facts. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, though his tone suggested it wasn't particularly good. "I understand you're trying to make a rather large withdrawal today." "That's correct," Margaret said simply. "This is quite unusual," he continued, glancing at the computer screen. "A withdrawal of this size requires additional verification. We need to make sure everything is legitimate." The word legitimate hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came when people questioned her. Right to exist in certain spaces, to have certain things, to make certain requests. "I've been banking here for over 40 years, she said quietly. "I opened my first account when I was 25 years old, just after I started teaching." The supervisor seemed unmoved by this information. "Nevertheless, we have procedures to follow. Large cash withdrawals can be associated with various activities that we need to be careful about." Margaret understood exactly what he was implying, and she felt a familiar anger begin to simmer beneath her calm exterior. It was the same anger she had felt when a department store security guard had followed her through the jewelry section, or when a restaurant hostess had tried to seat her near the kitchen despite her reservation. "What kind of activities?" she asked, her voice still controlled but with an edge that her former students would have recognized as a warning sign. The supervisor cleared his throat. "Well, money laundering, fraud, that sort of thing. We have to be vigilant about these matters." Behind Margaret, the line was growing longer and more restless. She could feel the weight of curious stares and hear the quiet murmurs of other customers speculating about what was happening. The situation was becoming exactly what she had hoped to avoid. A public spectacle that reduced her to a stereotype and a suspicion. Margaret took a deep breath, thinking about her nephew Kevin, who was probably sitting in his dorm room right now, wondering if his aunt would be able to help with his tuition payment that was due next week. She thought about her parents, who had taught her that dignity was something you carried inside yourself, regardless of how others treated you. She thought about the promise she had made to herself long ago, that she would never let other people's limitations define what she could or couldn't do. "I'll wait for your verification," she said finally, settling her purse more securely on her shoulder. "Take all the time you need." The supervisor, Mr. Davidson, stepped away from the counter to make a phone call, leaving Margaret standing there while the line behind her grew longer and more impatient. She could hear whispered conversation starting up around her, fragments of speculation about what might be wrong. Probably some kind of scam, someone muttered behind her. "You never know these days," another voice agreed. "People try all sorts of tricks." Margaret kept her eyes focused straight ahead, refusing to turn around and give these strangers the satisfaction of seeing how their words affected her. She had learned long ago that showing emotion in situations like this only made things worse. People would see tears or anger as confirmation that they were right to be suspicious. Mr. Davidson returned after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes. His expression had hardened during the phone call, and Margaret could tell that whatever conversation he'd had hadn't gone in her favor. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step over here," he said, gesturing toward a desk in the open area of the bank. His voice was loud enough that everyone in the lobby could hear. "We need to discuss this matter further." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Being asked to move away from the counter was like being pulled aside at an airport security checkpoint. It immediately marked her as someone suspicious, someone who didn't belong. "Is that really necessary?" she asked quietly. "I'm simply trying to withdraw money from my own account." "Bank policy," Davidson replied curtly. "Please come with me." Margaret had no choice but to follow him to the desk, aware that every eye in the bank was now watching her. The mother with the baby had stopped bouncing the child and was staring openly. The businessman who had been checking his watch was now checking his phone, probably posting about the drama on social media. Even the security guard by the door had turned his attention to the unfolding scene. Davidson sat down heavily in his chair and gestured for Margaret to take the seat across from him. The chair was positioned so that she was facing the entire lobby, putting her on display like someone being interrogated. "Now then," Davidson began, opening a folder and pulling out several forms. "Before we can process any large withdrawal, we need to verify several things. First, I need to see additional identification." Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license again, along with her Social Security card and her Medicare card. She placed them neatly on the desk, maintaining her composure despite the growing humiliation of the situation. Davidson examined each document carefully, holding them up to the light as if checking for forgeries. "These appear to be in order," he said grudgingly. "But I still have concerns about the nature of this transaction." "What concerns?" Margaret asked. "Well, frankly, ma'am, large cash withdrawals are often associated with illegal activities, money laundering, tax evasion, payments to criminal organizations. We have a responsibility to report suspicious transactions to federal authorities." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Are you accusing me of criminal activity?" "I'm not accusing you of anything," Davidson said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm simply following procedures designed to protect both the bank and our customers from fraud." He pulled out another form and began filling it out while he talked. "Now you say this money is for your nephew's college tuition. I'll need documentation to support that claim. Enrollment verification, tuition bills, that sort of thing." "I don't carry my nephew's college paperwork with me," Margaret said, her voice still controlled but with growing strain. "This is his personal information, and it's none of the bank's business what I do with my own money." Davidson looked up from his form with a patronizing smile. "Ma'am, when you're dealing with amounts this large, it becomes the bank's business. We have federal regulations to follow." Margaret knew enough about banking to realize that what he was saying wasn't entirely accurate. While banks did have reporting requirements for large transactions, the way Davidson was handling this situation went far beyond normal procedures. This felt personal, punitive. "I've made withdrawals from this account before," she said. "I've never had these problems." "Not for amounts like this," Davidson replied. "And frankly, given your circumstances, we need to be extra careful." "My circumstances?" Margaret repeated, her voice sharp. Davidson gestured vaguely in her direction. "Well, you know, you're clearly retired, probably on a fixed income. It's unusual for someone in your situation to have access to this kind of money. We need to make sure you're not being taken advantage of, or worse, participating in something illegal." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Here was a man who knew nothing about her. Nothing about her life or her background or her character, making assumptions based entirely on her appearance and his own prejudices. Around them, the bank had grown quieter as more people stopped their own business to watch the drama unfold. Margaret could feel their stares like weights on her shoulders. She could imagine what they were thinking, the same thoughts that Davidson was voicing out loud. "Furthermore," Davidson continued, apparently emboldened by what he interpreted as Margaret's silence being submission, "I need to ask about the source of these funds. Have you recently received any large payments from unknown individuals? Any requests to withdraw money on behalf of someone else? These are common elements in money laundering schemes targeting elderly individuals." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "You think I'm some kind of victim of a scam?" "It happens more often than you might think," Davidson said, his tone now taking on a false kindness that was somehow worse than his earlier suspicion. "Criminals target people like you specifically because you're trusting and might not understand modern financial schemes." "People like me," Margaret repeated slowly. "Elderly individuals, particularly those from certain backgrounds. You might not be familiar with how sophisticated these criminal operations can be." Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. There it was laid bare, not just ageism, but racism too, wrapped up in a package of false concern and bureaucratic authority. The security guard had moved closer to their desk, though he was trying to look casual about it. Margaret realized that Davidson had probably signaled him over, marking her as a potential threat that needed to be watched. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that you're making assumptions about me that are both incorrect and inappropriate." Davidson's false smile faded. "Ma'am, I'm simply doing my job. If you're unwilling to cooperate with our verification process, I'll have no choice but to freeze this account pending a full investigation." "Freeze my account." Margaret's voice rose slightly, causing several people nearby to look over with renewed interest. It's a standard procedure when we suspect fraudulent activity, Davidson said, his hand already reaching for another form. We'll need to contact federal authorities, run a full background check, verify the source of all deposits made in the last several years. Margaret realized that what had started as a simple transaction had spiraled into something much more serious. Davidson wasn't just questioning her right to withdraw her own money. He was threatening to effectively lock her out of her own financial life, based on nothing more than his prejudices and assumptions. She thought about Kevin, waiting for the tuition money. She thought about her other accounts, her investments, her carefully planned retirement, all of it potentially thrown into chaos. Because one small-minded man couldn't believe that the quiet Asian woman in front of him might legitimately have access to substantial funds. This is ridiculous, she said, her composure finally beginning to crack. I am not a criminal. I am not a victim. I am a customer trying to withdraw money from my own account, and you are treating me like a suspect based on nothing but your own assumptions. Davidson leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice. Causing a disturbance will only make this situation worse. Margaret looked around the lobby and realized that every conversation had stopped. Every eye was on her. She had become the entertainment, the cautionary tale, the suspicious character in everyone else's ordinary Tuesday morning. But more than that, she had become exactly what people like Davidson expected her to be, the difficult customer, the unreasonable person, the one causing problems. Margaret took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Margaret reached into her purse with deliberate slowness, her fingers moving past the worn wallet and the small notebook where she kept her account numbers, past the reading glasses in their simple case and the roll of mints she always carried for her dry mouth. Her hand found what she was looking for in a small side pocket she rarely used. She pulled out a business card holder, made of simple black leather, and opened it carefully. Inside were several cards, all pristine white with elegant black lettering. She selected one and placed it on the desk in front of Davidson, then folded her hands in her lap and waited. Davidson glanced down at the card dismissively, clearly expecting to see something related to teaching, or perhaps a Social Security office. His eyes moved across the text once, then again more slowly. The color began to drain from his face as he read the words. Margaret Chen, Principal Shareholder, Chen Holdings Investment Group. I think, Margaret said quietly, you should make another phone call. Davidson picked up the card with trembling fingers, turning it over as if expecting to find something on the back that would explain this unexpected development. This has to be some kind of mistake. No mistake, Margaret replied. Perhaps you should call your regional manager. The number is on the back of that card. Davidson flipped the card over and saw a handwritten phone number in Margaret's careful script. You wrote this number yourself, he said, grasping for some explanation that would make sense of what he was seeing. Yes, I did. It's the direct line to someone who can explain my relationship with this bank in more detail. The young teller with pink nails had been watching the exchange from behind the counter. Unable to contain her curiosity any longer, she pulled out her phone and typed Chen Holdings Investment Group into her search browser. What she saw on her screen made her gasp audibly. Oh my God, she whispered to her coworker. Chen Holdings owns 17 banks. They're worth like hundreds of millions of dollars. Her whisper carried across the quiet lobby, reaching the ears of several customers who immediately began pulling out their own phones to search for the same information. Within minutes, a ripple of shocked murmurs began spreading through the bank as people realized what was happening. Davidson was still staring at the business card as if it might disappear if he looked away. This doesn't make sense, he said, more to himself than to Margaret. You look like... Like what? Margaret asked, her voice carrying a steel that hadn't been there before. Like someone who couldn't possibly own anything of value? Like someone who doesn't deserve to be treated with basic respect? The businessman who had been impatiently checking his watch earlier was now openly staring, his mouth slightly agape. The mother with the baby had stopped trying to keep the child quiet and was focused entirely on the unfolding drama. Even the elderly man with the loan application had looked up from his paperwork to watch. Davidson's hands were visibly shaking now as he reached for his phone. I need to verify this information, he stammered. Of course you do, Margaret said calmly. Please take your time. As Davidson dialed the number, Margaret turned slightly in her chair to address the growing crowd of onlookers. Her voice was clear and carrying, pitched with the authority of someone who had commanded classroom attention for 3 decades. "I suppose you're all wondering what's happening here," she said. "This gentleman has been questioning my right to withdraw money from my own account because he doesn't believe someone who looks like me could legitimately have access to substantial funds." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others continued staring, transfixed by this unexpected turn of events. Davidson was now speaking in urgent, hushed tones into his phone. "Yes, sir, I understand, but—" "No, sir, I realize that, but—" "Yes, sir, she's sitting right here." Margaret could hear the voice on the other end growing louder and more agitated. Though she couldn't make out the specific words, Davidson's face went from pale to flushed red as the conversation continued. "Yes, sir, no, sir. I understand completely, sir." When he finally hung up the phone, Davidson sat staring at it for a long moment as if it had betrayed him. The business card lay on the desk between them like evidence of his colossal error in judgment. "The regional manager would like to speak with you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sure he would," Margaret replied. "But first I believe you have a withdrawal to process." Davidson nodded mechanically and began typing at his computer with shaking hands. The confident, condescending man who had been lecturing Margaret about bank procedures and criminal activity just minutes before had been replaced by someone who looked like he might be sick at any moment. The young teller with pink nails had abandoned all pretense of working and was now openly Googling everything she could find about Margaret and Chen Holdings. "It says here she started with just a teacher's salary," she whispered excitedly to anyone who would listen. "Built the whole company from scratch. She owns pieces of banks all over the state." More customers were pulling out their phones, some taking pictures of Margaret, others calling friends to tell them about the incredible scene they were witnessing. The bank had transformed from a quiet Tuesday morning routine into something resembling a celebrity sighting, but Margaret seemed unaffected by the growing attention. She sat calmly in her chair, hands folded, watching Davidson struggle with the computer system that he had been navigating so confidently just minutes before. "Having trouble?" she asked politely. "No, ma'am, just making sure everything is processed correctly," Davidson replied, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the bank's air conditioning. "I appreciate your attention to detail," Margaret said. "It's so important to follow proper procedures, don't you think?" Davidson winced at her words, recognizing them as an echo of his earlier condescending lecture. "Yes, ma'am." The security guard who had been positioned near their desk was now backing away, apparently realizing that his services were no longer needed to monitor a potential threat. Instead, his job had suddenly become protecting someone very important from the growing crowd of curious onlookers. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled slightly. That would be my nephew Kevin, asking if I was able to help with his tuition. "Such a good boy. Studying engineering, you know." "Very bright," Davidson nodded mutely, still typing and occasionally wiping his hands on his pants when they became too sweaty to grip the keyboard properly. "He's the first in our family to go to college," Margaret continued conversationally. "Well, except for me, of course. I was the first to graduate from university. My parents were so proud. They came to America with nothing, you know. Worked 3 jobs each to pay for my education." The computer finally chimed with a completion sound, and Davidson printed out a receipt with obvious relief. "Your withdrawal has been processed, ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you," Margaret said graciously. "I do appreciate your help." She stood up slowly, smoothing down her cardigan and adjusting her purse strap. Around the lobby, conversations had stopped again as people waited to see what would happen next. "Oh, and Mr. Davidson?" Margaret said, turning back to face the desk. "Yes, ma'am? I'll be having a conversation with the bank president about today's experience. I think it would be valuable for the staff to receive some additional training about customer service and, perhaps more importantly, about making assumptions based on appearances." Davidson swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. I understand." Margaret smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "I hope you do understand. You see, this isn't really about me. I'll be fine regardless of how I'm treated here. But what about the next elderly customer who comes in? Or the next person whose appearance doesn't match your expectations? How will you treat them?" The question hung in the air as Margaret walked toward the door. her comfortable shoes making the same soft sounds against the marble floor that they had when she'd entered an hour ago. Margaret had barely reached her car in the parking lot when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she recognized as the bank president's direct line. She let it ring 3 times before answering, settling into the driver's seat of her practical Honda Accord. "Hello, Mrs. Chen. This is Patricia Reynolds, president of First National Bank. I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am about what happened this morning." Margaret listened quietly as Patricia's voice rushed through an explanation of how she had received an urgent call from the regional office, how she had immediately reviewed the security footage, how she was mortified by her employee's behavior. "I appreciate your call," Margaret said finally, "but I think it would be more valuable if we met in person to discuss this situation properly." "Of course, absolutely. When would be convenient for you? I can clear my entire schedule." "This afternoon at 2 o'clock would be fine," Margaret replied. "And Patricia, I'd like the entire staff present for our conversation." 2 hours later, Margaret returned to the bank. This time, however, her arrival was very different. Patricia Reynolds was waiting in the lobby to greet her personally, along with the assistant manager and the security supervisor. Word had apparently spread quickly through the banking network, because Margaret noticed several people she didn't recognize who appeared to be executives. From the corporate office, the lobby had been temporarily closed to regular customers for what was being called a mandatory staff training session. All 15 employees stood in a semicircle, their faces showing various degrees of nervousness, curiosity, and embarrassment. Davidson stood slightly apart from the group. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The young teller with pink nails kept glancing at Margaret with a mixture of awe and fear, probably wondering if she was about to lose her job. "Thank you all for gathering," Margaret began, her teacher's voice carrying easily across the marble space. "I know this is unusual, but I thought it was important for us to have a conversation about what happened this morning." She paused, looking around the circle of faces. "How many of you have been working here for more than 5 years?" About half the hands went up. "And how many of you recognized me when I came in this morning?" The hands went down. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. "That's because I've been very deliberate about maintaining my privacy. When I visit my banks, I dress the same way I always have. I drive the same car I've driven for 8 years. I carry the same purse my grandmother gave me. I don't announce who I am because I want to see how you treat ordinary customers." She began walking slowly around the semicircle as she spoke, making eye contact with each employee. "Let me tell you a story," she continued. 42 years ago, I was a 25-year-old math teacher making $18,000 a year. I came to this bank to open my first savings account with a deposit of $57. It was all the money I had left after paying my rent and buying groceries. Several employees shifted uncomfortably, beginning to understand where this story was heading. The teller that day was a young man about Mr. Davidson's age. He looked at my $57 and suggested that maybe I should consider a piggy bank instead of a real savings account. He thought it was funny. His supervisor thought it was funny too. Margaret stopped walking and stood in the center of the circle. I went home that night and made myself a promise. I promised that if I ever had the opportunity, I would make sure that no one else would be treated the way I was treated that day. The way I was treated again this morning. Patricia Reynolds stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that Mr. Davidson's behavior does not represent our values or our training standards." "Doesn't it?" Margaret asked gently. "Because from what I observed, Mr. Davidson felt very comfortable making his assumptions public. He felt confident that his behavior would be supported by bank policy and by his colleagues. That suggests this isn't an isolated incident." She turned to address Davidson directly. "You told me that large withdrawals are often associated with criminal activity. That's technically true, but you applied that general principle specifically to me based on your assessment of how a criminal might look. Do you see the difference?" Davidson nodded miserably. "Yes, ma'am. You suggested that I might be the victim of a scam because people like me are often targeted." "What did you mean by people like me, Mr. Davidson?" I meant elderly people," he stammered. "Just elderly people," Margaret pressed. "Because I got the impression there were other factors influencing your judgment." Davidson's face flushed red, but he remained silent. Margaret turned back to the group. "Let me tell you how I built my wealth because I think it's important for you to understand. that financial success doesn't always look the way you might expect. She moved to stand near the windows, the afternoon light highlighting the gray in her hair and the simple lines of her clothing. I saved 20% of every paycheck for 15 years. I lived in a tiny apartment and bought my clothes at thrift stores. I drove used cars until they wouldn't run anymore. Every dollar I saved, I invested carefully in index funds and real estate. The employees listened intently, many of them probably doing mental calculations about their own savings rates. When my parents died, they left me a small inheritance, $43,000, which represented every penny they had managed to save working as a seamstress and a janitor for 30 years. I invested that money too. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. During the 2008 financial crisis, when everyone else was panicking and selling their investments, I saw opportunity. I bought real estate when prices crashed. I purchased stock in solid companies when their share prices were at rock bottom. And yes, I bought controlling interests in small community banks that were struggling to survive. She gestured around the lobby. This bank was one of those purchases. I bought it not because I wanted to be rich, but because I believed in the importance of community banking. I believed that local banks should serve local people with respect and dignity. The young teller with pink nails raised her hand tentatively. Mrs. Chen, can I ask why you kept teaching if you had so much money? Margaret smiled at her. Because I love teaching. Money was never the goal. It was just a tool. I wanted to help young people learn to think critically, to solve problems, to believe in their own potential. That was more fulfilling to me than any amount of wealth. She paused, her expression growing more serious. But I also kept teaching because I remembered what it felt like to be dismissed and underestimated. Every day in my classroom, I saw students who were written off by other teachers because they didn't fit certain expectations. I made sure those students knew that someone believed in them. Patricia Reynolds spoke up. Mrs. Chen, what can we do to make sure something like this never happens again? Margaret considered the question carefully. First, you need to examine your training procedures. Are you teaching your employees to recognize potential fraud? Or are you teaching them to profile customers based on appearance? There's a significant difference. She began walking around the circle again. Second, you need to understand that respect isn't something customers have to earn through their bank balance or their clothing choices. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. Davidson finally found his voice. Mrs. Chen, I know there's nothing I can say to make up for how I treated you today. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Margaret stopped in front of him. Mr. Davidson, your apology is noted. But I'm more interested in what you're going to learn from this experience. Are you sorry because I turned out to be wealthy? Or are you sorry because you treated another human being with disrespect? Davidson thought carefully before answering. I'm sorry because I treated you with disrespect. I made assumptions that were wrong and hurtful, and I would have been wrong even if you hadn't been who you are. That's the right answer, Margaret said. Because my wealth doesn't make me more deserving of respect than the next customer. It just makes my complaints louder. She turned to address the entire group again. I want to share something with all of you. I visit my banks regularly, usually without identifying myself. I watch how you treat customers, especially elderly customers. Customers who don't speak perfect English. Customers whose clothing or appearance might not meet certain expectations. The employees exchanged nervous glances, probably wondering if she had been watching them specifically. What I've learned over the years is that the character of a bank isn't determined by its policies or its marketing materials. It's determined by how the most vulnerable customers are treated on the most ordinary days. Margaret moved toward the center of the circle again. From now on, I'll be implementing some changes. We're going to have quarterly training sessions focused on unconscious bias and customer respect. We're going to review our policies to make sure they're applied fairly and consistently, and we're going to establish a customer advocacy program to help people who feel they've been treated unfairly. She looked around the room one final time. I want this bank to be known as a place where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, their accent, their age, or their account balance. Because that's not just good business practice, it's the right thing to do. 6 months later, Margaret walked through the same glass doors of First National Bank, wearing the same brown cardigan and carrying the same worn leather purse. But this time, everything was different. The young teller with pink nails, whose name Margaret had learned was Rebecca, looked up immediately and smiled warmly. Good morning, Mrs. Chen. How can I help you today? Margaret approached the counter, noting the subtle changes that had been implemented since her last dramatic visit. There was a new sign near the entrance that read, "We value every customer and treat everyone with dignity and respect." More importantly, she could see that the staff's attitudes had genuinely shifted. "I'd like to make a deposit today," Margaret said, pulling out a check from her purse. "Of course," Rebecca replied, her tone friendly and professional. "And how has Kevin been doing with his studies?" Margaret smiled, pleased that Rebecca remembered details about her family. "He's doing wonderfully. He'll be graduating next month with his engineering degree." As Rebecca processed the deposit, Margaret observed the interactions happening around the bank. At the next counter, the older teller with kind eyes was patiently helping an elderly gentleman who was having trouble hearing the instructions. Instead of speaking louder or showing frustration, she had written the key information on a piece of paper and was going through each step slowly. At another window, a young mother was making a transaction while juggling a fussy toddler. The male teller, who had previously moved with mechanical efficiency, was engaging the child with gentle conversation while helping the mother, making the experience pleasant rather than stressful. Margaret's changes had gone far beyond just training sessions. She had implemented what she called the Golden Rule policy: treat every customer the way you would want your grandmother treated. She had also established a customer feedback system that allowed people to report both positive and negative experiences directly to corporate management. "Mrs. Chen," Rebecca handed her the deposit receipt. "I wanted to thank you again for the scholarship program you started. My little sister Julie received one of the grants, and she's starting community college in the fall." Margaret had quietly established a scholarship fund for children of bank employees, understanding that when people felt valued and supported, they were more likely to treat others with kindness. "I'm so glad to hear that. Julie is a bright girl. She'll do wonderful things." As Margaret turned to leave, she noticed a familiar figure entering the bank. It was the businessman who had been checking his watch impatiently during her confrontation with Davidson 6 months ago. Today he nodded respectfully when he saw her, a gesture of recognition for someone whose story had become legendary in the local business community. The story of what happened that Tuesday morning had spread far beyond just this single bank. Local newspapers had picked up the tale, business journals had written about it, and it had become a case study in several customer service training programs across the region. But more importantly, it had sparked conversations in boardrooms and break rooms about unconscious bias and the assumptions people make about others. Margaret had received hundreds of letters from people sharing their own experiences of being judged unfairly, of being dismissed or disrespected because of their appearance, age, accent, or perceived economic status. Many wrote to thank her for speaking up, for using her position and influence to address something that affected countless people who didn't have her resources or platform. As she walked toward her car, Margaret reflected on how the incident had changed not just the bank but her own life as well. She had always been private about her wealth, but the experience had shown her the power of visibility. Sometimes hiding in plain sight wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to step into the light to create change. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Kevin. "Aunt Margaret, I got the job. The engineering firm made me an offer. Thank you for everything you've done for me." Margaret smiled as she typed back, "I'm so proud of you. Your parents would be thrilled. Hard work and education always pay off." But Kevin's success was about more than just the tuition money she had provided. It was about the lesson she had tried to teach him through her own example. That true wealth wasn't measured in bank balances, but in how you used whatever resources you had to lift up others. She thought about Davidson, who had been transferred to a different branch after completing extensive sensitivity training. Patricia Reynolds had wanted to fire him, but Margaret had intervened. She believed in second chances, in the possibility that people could learn and grow from their mistakes. The last she had heard, Davidson was actually doing well in his new position and had become an advocate for fair customer treatment. Margaret drove through her old neighborhood, past the small apartment where she had lived as a young teacher, past the thrift stores where she had bought her clothes, past the library where she had spent countless hours researching investment strategies. These places reminded her of who she had been and why she had made the choices that led to her success. She stopped at her nephew's university, where a small plaque on the mathematics building read, "Chen Family Learning Center." It was one of her few public acknowledgments of her philanthropy, established to provide tutoring and support for first-generation college students who were struggling with the transition to higher education. Inside the building, she found Kevin in one of the study rooms, helping a younger student work through calculus problems. He looked up when she entered, his face breaking into a wide grin. "Aunt Margaret, I didn't expect to see you today. I wanted to congratulate you in person," she said, giving him a hug. "I'm so proud of what you've accomplished." As they talked, Margaret watched Kevin interact with the student he was tutoring. He was patient and encouraging, never making the younger boy feel stupid for not understanding a concept. She could see her parents' values reflected in him, the same values that had guided her own life. Work hard, treat others with respect, and always remember where you came from. "You know," Kevin said as they walked across campus together, "I've been thinking a lot about that day at the bank, about how that man treated you." "Oh?" Margaret replied, curious to hear his perspective. "It made me realize how often I probably make assumptions about people without even thinking about it. Like I might see someone and think I know their story based on how they look or dress or talk." Margaret nodded. "It's human nature to some extent. We all make quick judgments as a way of processing information. The key is being aware of those assumptions and being willing to challenge them." They stopped at Kevin's dormitory, where other students were packing up their belongings for graduation. Many of them recognized Margaret from news stories and social media posts about the bank incident. But she was grateful that Kevin's friends treated her simply as his aunt, not as some kind of celebrity. "I have something for you," Margaret said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Kevin opened it to find a simple silver watch with an inscription on the back. "Time is the most valuable thing you can give to others. Love, Aunt Margaret." "I wanted you to have something to remind you that success isn't just about what you achieve for yourself," she said. "It's about how you use your time and talents to help others." As Margaret drove home that evening, she reflected on how one morning's humiliation had transformed into something much larger and more meaningful. The incident at the bank had been painful, but it had also been an opportunity to create positive change. She thought about all the customers who would be treated better because of the training programs she had implemented, all the employees who would think twice before making assumptions about people, all the young people who would receive scholarships and support because she had chosen to use her resources purposefully. Margaret had learned long ago that wealth without purpose was just numbers in an account. But wealth used to create dignity, opportunity, and respect for others. That was something truly valuable. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. It was Patricia Reynolds from the bank. "Mrs. Chen, I have some news I think you'll be interested in," Patricia said. "We've been selected as the regional winner for the Customer Service Excellence Award. The judges specifically mentioned our commitment to treating all customers with dignity and respect." Margaret smiled as she listened to Patricia's excited description of the award ceremony and the recognition the bank would receive. But what pleased her most was the knowledge that this recognition represented real change, not just good publicity. "Patricia," Margaret said, "I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. But remember, this isn't the end goal. It's just the beginning." As she hung up the phone and walked toward her modest house, Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because of the recognition or the success, but because she had kept the promise she had made to herself all those years ago. No one would be made to feel small or unworthy in her banks. Every customer would be treated with the dignity and respect that should be every person's birthright. And perhaps most importantly, the next young teacher who walked into one of her banks with $57 and a dream would be welcomed with encouragement rather than condescension. That, Margaret thought as she unlocked her front door, was a legacy worth building.